There is a grain that grew in Africa 10,000 years ago. It crossed deserts, it crossed oceans, it fed empires, it survived droughts that destroyed everything planted beside it. And right now, today, it is one of the most grown crops on American soil, and almost no one eats it. This is the story of sorghum, and the reason it disappeared from your plate is not what you think. Welcome to CozyClip. There are roughly 30,000 edible plant species on this planet. Out of all of them, humanity has chosen to depend on just 3 for most of its calories: wheat, rice, and corn. 3 crops, 1 planet. And somewhere quietly, a grain that is older than all 3 of them was pushed to the edges. There is a grain that grew in Africa 10,000 years ago. It crossed deserts, it crossed oceans, it fed empires, it survived droughts that destroyed everything planted beside it. And right now, today, it is one of the most grown crops on American soil, and almost no one eats it. This is the story of sorghum, and the reason it disappeared from your plate is not what you think. Welcome to CozyClip. There are roughly 30,000 edible plant species on this planet. Out of all of them, humanity has chosen to depend on just 3 for most of its calories: wheat, rice, and corn. 3 crops, 1 planet. And somewhere, quietly, a grain that is older than all 3 of them in organized cultivation was pushed to the edges of the American food system, not because it was weak, not because it was bad, but because of how the supply chain was built. Let us go back. Around 8,000 BC, in northeastern Africa, near the border of what is now Egypt and Sudan, archaeologists uncovered evidence of one of the oldest cultivated grains on Earth at a site called Nabta Playa. The people who lived there were already growing sorghum. That is 10,000 years ago. At that time, wheat and rice were still being shaped by early farmers in other parts of the world. Sorghum was already mature, already feeding people, already surviving in soil and heat that would have destroyed most other crops. From Africa it began to spread. It moved into the Indian subcontinent around 4,000 years ago. It reached West Africa around 3,000 years ago. During the Arab agricultural revolution in the Middle Ages, it traveled all the way to Spain. And at every step, sorghum carried something with it, an ability to grow where other grains could not. It could thrive in dry land. It could grow in heavy clay or sandy soil. It did not need the kind of carefully prepared fields that wheat demanded. It did not need the flooded paddies that rice required. It needed patience. It needed sun. And very little else. There is a reason botanists eventually called it the camel of crops. It is patient. It is resilient. It does not need much to survive. Now let us talk about what sorghum actually is, because most people in the United States have never seen it up close. It is a tall grass. In some varieties, it can grow to 15 feet. It produces a dense cluster of grain at the top, something like a head of millet, but larger, heavier, and more generous. The grain itself comes in many colors: white, red, pink, brown, yellow. Each color has been used differently across cultures. White sorghum is common in breads and porridges. Red and brown varieties have been used for dyes, for fermented drinks, and for traditional foods that have existed for thousands of years. It is not one thing. It is many things. And that versatility was, for a long time, its greatest strength. Scientifically, sorghum is what is called a C4 plant. This is a technical term, but the meaning is simple. C4 plants are exceptionally efficient at converting sunlight into energy. They do this better than most grains in hot conditions. That is why sorghum matures so quickly, some varieties in as little as 75 days. It does not waste time. It captures what it needs from the air and the light, and it grows. It also needs dramatically less water than corn. Some sources suggest it requires around 30% less water than comparable grain crops. and 91% of the sorghum that is grown in the United States is rain-fed, meaning it does not rely on irrigation systems at all. It simply waits for the rain. In a world where water is becoming one of the most contested resources on Earth, that is not a minor detail. Sorghum also suppresses weeds naturally. It produces a compound called sorgoleone, which discourages other plants from taking root nearby. This means farmers growing sorghum need fewer herbicides, less chemical intervention, less cost. It is a crop that, in many ways, asks less of the land than the crops we have chosen to center our food system around. So how did sorghum arrive in America? By the time it reached the shores of the United States, it had already traveled across continents and centuries. The first recorded mention of sorghum in America comes from Benjamin Franklin himself. In 1757, he wrote to a friend about a variety called broom corn, which was used to make brooms. But sorghum was already present on American soil before that letter was written. Many historians and researchers believe it traveled to the American South through the transatlantic slave trade, carried by African people who had grown up with it, who already knew how to cultivate it, how to cook it, how to turn it into syrup and flour and fermented beverages. Indigenous communities across the American plains and the southern states grew sorghum for generations. They made a rich sweetener from the juice in its stalks, a molasses-like liquid that was used on pancakes, on biscuits, and stirred into dozens of recipes. They ground the grain into flour for baking. They dried the stalks and used them for building and for fencing. For black farmers in the South, sorghum was not just a crop. It was a lifeline. It was versatile enough that a single plant could produce food, feed for animals, sweetener, and even material for the home. It was exactly the kind of crop a family needed when resources were scarce. And resources for many of these communities were always scarce. So what happened? Why did this grain, this ancient and adaptable and quietly extraordinary grain, disappear from the American plate? The answer is not dramatic. It is not a single moment or a single decision. It is a slow, structural shift. And it all comes down to how the supply chain was built. Think about what it takes for a crop to become part of your daily life. It is not enough for it to grow well. It has to be harvested at scale. It has to be stored. It has to be shipped across the country. It has to be processed, turned into flour, into syrup, into the ingredients that end up in the foods you buy at the grocery store. And all of that processing happens inside factories. Factories that were designed and built for specific crops. In the United States, that entire industrial food system was built around corn. Corn became the center of American agriculture for several reasons. It was easier to mechanize at scale than many other grains. It produced high yields in the specific conditions of the Midwest. And the American government began subsidizing it heavily, consistently, and for decades. Since 1995, the federal government has paid out more than $116 billion in subsidies to corn farmers. Wheat received around $48 billion over that same period. Corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, and rice became what are known as the Big Five, the 5 crops that receive the overwhelming majority of federal agricultural support. Sorghum did receive some subsidies, but they were small, a fraction of what corn received. And when the money flows in one direction, everything else follows. The factories get built for corn. The processing infrastructure gets designed for wheat. The scientists get funded to study corn yields, corn diseases, corn genetics. Year after year, decade after decade, the system reinforced itself. And sorghum, with all its quiet strengths, was simply not part of that reinforcement. It was not that no one knew what sorghum could do. Scientists and farmers absolutely understood it. A famous botanist named Jack Harlan declared in 1971 that sorghum is one of the really indispensable crops required for the survival of humankind. Indispensable. That is not a casual word. But knowing something is valuable and building a system to support it are two very different things. And the system was not being built for sorghum. It was being built for corn. So in the United States today, we have a paradox. The United States is the largest producer of grain sorghum on the planet. It grows more sorghum than any other nation, and yet almost none of it reaches the American dinner table. Most of it goes to livestock feed. About a third of it goes to ethanol fuel for cars. The grain that once fed civilizations across Africa, India, and the ancient Arab world is being grown in American fields and turned into something other than food. Meanwhile, in Africa and parts of Asia, sorghum remains a cornerstone of daily life. More than 500 million people in over 30 countries eat it as a regular part of their diet. They make injera a fermented flatbread that is central to Ethiopian cuisine. They make couscous from it in West Africa. They make porridges, fermented drinks, unleavened breads, and dozens of other traditional foods. It is not a forgotten crop in those places. It is a living one. The disconnect is quiet, but it is real. The same grain is a foundation of food on one side of the world and invisible on the other. And the reasons are not about the grain. They are about money. They are about infrastructure. They are about where decades of policy pointed and where they did not. There is no single villain in this story. No company set out to erase sorghum. No government issued an order to remove it from shelves. What happened is slower than that. It is the accumulated weight of choices, funding decisions, factory designs, insurance structures, research priorities, all reinforcing each other over generations. It is how systems work. They grow in one direction, and everything that does not fit that direction becomes invisible. But something is shifting now. Droughts are becoming more frequent and more severe across the Great Plains. The Ogallala Aquifer, which supplies irrigation water to a massive stretch of American farmland, is being drained far faster than rain can refill it. Water is becoming scarce. And in that scarcity, a crop that barely needs any is beginning to look less like a relic and more like a necessity. Farmers in Kansas, Texas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma are planting sorghum with renewed seriousness. Some are growing it not as a supplement, but as a primary crop in their rotation. They are watching how it performs in heat and drought where corn struggles. They are noticing how it holds. Researchers are beginning to fund it more deliberately. Sorghum is now found in more than 1,000 consumer products across the United States, in flours, in pretzels, in whole grain options appearing quietly on grocery store shelves. It is not loud. It is not marketing itself. But it is returning. 10,000 years of history do not disappear forever. They wait. And sorghum has been waiting. Not because someone invented it or discovered it or decided it was suddenly useful, but because the land itself is asking for something different. The grain that crossed oceans and fed empires is still here. It was never truly gone. It was just sleeping. And slowly, quietly, it is waking up. The next time you see it on a shelf, you will know what you are looking at. You will know where it came from, and you will know exactly why it matters.